So welcome everybody to the next sort of 45 minutes to an hour or so of our panel discussion, conversation and questions. My name is Stephanie Dieckvoss. I'm a lecturer, I'm a writer, I'm a researcher, and lots of other things. So that's me, but I'm of course much more delighted to introduce these two wonderful artists sitting next to me. Pia Ortuño and Tami. Pia's work is in the show, but Tami sadly isn't, and I really, really regret that because I have known neither of the artists before, so I only had a very in-depth look as a video walk through her last exhibition, and I really think anybody who can get a chance to see any shows you might have coming up or any work should really go and do and see that. So anyway, so now I need to go back to my notes. Okay, Pia Ortuño was born in Costa Rica in San Jose in 1996 and is an artist currently living and working in London, and we can be really grateful for that, that she's with us. She graduated from the University of Costa Rica with a BA in Fine Arts and then later moved to Pietrasanta in Italy, which I think is really fascinating, to work with and learn about ancient marble and bronze techniques. And as we just discussed, she also learned welding when she was in Italy, so she's a really sort of hands-on material, sort of can work with stone, metal, and sculpture. She apprenticed under Jimenez de Heredia in his Carrara studio and worked at the Fonderia Artistic Mariani in 2020. She is the co-founder of Sala Salon, and then came also to London to do an MA in painting at the Royal College of Art, from which she graduated in 2022. Ortuño has exhibited in the UK and internationally with her first solo show at Incubator Gallery in London. As I said already, there are works of hers dispersed in this exhibition. And also for anyone who wants to go to Mayfair or Central London this afternoon, it's the last day of her two-people exhibition with Fold Gallery, which is also a commercial exhibition in near Good Street in Central London. So then Tami Soji-Akinyemi. So I just start, and I'm not reading, I read all the relevant bits, but so Pia and Tami did the same MA in painting at the Royal College of Art and graduated together, but did not know that they were invited to the same panel. So it's not a setup, but I'm really pleased that the two know each other. So I think that's really fabulous. So Tami is a Londoner, born in 1991. She's a multidisciplinary artist. And I think sort of this notion of multidisciplinary practice is really also embodied in her own career. She first did a BA in fashion design from the University of Creative Arts, but then obviously was interested more into artistic practice and holds an MA in painting from the Royal College of Art. She recently had an exhibition at Common Age Projects, also in East London, which sadly closed just a couple of weeks ago, and that was a large-scale installation, intervention into the physical space that mingled sort of installation with a sound piece, and I think sort of that's really fascinating, and also was based on a short story by Franz Kafka. So. Okay, I know we want to talk about the future, but when we talk about the future, I also think, it would be really interesting to talk about Franz Kafka. But anyway, so yes, because I really need to stop talking, I would like to invite first Pia and then Tami maybe just to start and talk a little bit about sort of the topic of today's panel discussion, what that brings to mind, how you relate either to the notion of future, also the question of sort of no one's property, what does either or both of these things mean for you? Pia, do you want to kick us off? Thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thanks everybody for coming. I guess the way when we first started discussing the topic about the future, Tami came with the question of whether introducing it through our own art practice. Mm-hmm. And I believe that's the best way that I can understand the future, because that's how I relate to it through my work. As a multidisciplinary artist, I try to use materials as the way that I speak about the work. And for me, most of the materials that I use will decompose and return to a natural state. I use salts, wood, metals. And for me, it's important to know that to walk into the future, there has to be a beginning and an end. And that idea of having a relationship of the now can walk us into the future with a much disposed idea of there will be an end, but there still will be a continuation. And yeah, I think that's a little bit of just the relationship between me and the work, and when the work is leaving my studio and heading into somebody else's space, kind of leaving a mark and then letting it be free into the world and continuing.
Hi. So I would say that I think about the future in terms of, well, firstly, I'm a dreamer, so I'm always kind of projecting ideas and, an image of myself and, I don't know, everything into the future as this thing that's so far ahead and kind of blurry. I think the difference between, I guess maybe other people is that I kind of mark all of the steps to get there in terms of I don't know, I think about art and life in the future as very big ideas and ambitious ideas, but I always think about the future as everything working exactly how I want it to and I need it to until I get there, and not thinking about things going wrong or things not happening when I want. And so relating that to my artwork, I think that I always think about all of these different possibilities, and I'm thinking in my process a lot about all of the little notations that, or labels that, or kind of marker points that need to happen to get to an end goal. So I've got, for example, in my phone, lots and lots of exhibitions planned that apparently are going to happen at specific galleries in 5 years. And it sounds ridiculous, but I think imagination and thinking like that can open up possibilities of different ways of thinking. Yeah. I don't know if I answered the question.
Totally. Although I do have a follow-up questions, because I'm always really interested in, and when I speak to artists, and obviously I'm not an artist. I trained as an art historian, so I don't come from the making side. But I'm really interested about the relationship of artists to their work and what happens or how they feel when it actually goes into the world. Pia, as you were saying, you let it then go free. And I always think that that's an interesting way also to think about the future, because it's you externalize it from yourself, and the objects hold a bit of yourself and then leads their own lives. So Tami, I wonder how you see that. Because I think, for example, with your last exhibition, if it's an installation, I assume it doesn't exist afterwards, right? But you also make work that does exist. Yeah. So what's your relationship to that idea?
I think I'm thinking a lot about the archive and how, I already think about objects as holding some kind of experience or a spirit or something in them of the experience of making, and the process as this kind of ephemeral thing, but that holds this kind of invisible kind of skin almost. But I've been thinking more lately about how to kind of archive from now, sort of into the future. So for example, my exhibition included past work that I had sort of dismantled and rearranged, so that's kind of also included in new work. And I'm thinking about how many times I can do that, and does that cut off when somebody buys a work, maybe? Or is this something that I have to hold in order to have kind of ownership of it, so that that process can continue? Yeah, it's a bit of a complicated one because, you know, with installations, you put them up and it's an experience in itself, but then it's also material. So if I'm going to make work from that, for example, because it's like meters and meters of linen, for example, am I going to then turn it into a sort of more stable version of itself in a painting, and then that kind of cuts the like tie of the potential newness afterwards?
I would agree with that idea that, and it also relates to my own work because I consider myself a hoarder of sorts. My studio is completely filled with objects that I don't know when I'm going to use them. I just collect and then suddenly they become part of a work, but they have definitely had a history. And I believe that history is as important as the place where they're going next. So I guess in specific works, for example, this purple piece that you can see here, it holds objects that I've collected, but they've changed since the moment that they've been placed there. And they were very different from when I brought them into my studio. And the moment that this work left my studio, I completely relinquished control of what was going to happen to that object. And if this either comes back to my studio or goes into some other environment, that object will continue to change. And the idea of controlling change to the future is something that I've battled very much, because there's this idea of preserving art and preserving the object for it to endure a longer history. And I guess the archive, now that we have this idea of the digital archive as well, can hold a memory in a more static environment. But I'm not necessarily agreeing with that, because we're not static. As artists, we're not static. As people, we're not static. But somehow we are asking the work to be. And I think that's something that I'm constantly battling in my art practice, when people want something to be stable, either rust or salt or pigments. And I think with installations it's the same. We can photograph an installation or video it and have that experience and kind of relive it as a memory. But our internal archive as well as the digital archive serve as a memory rather than the actual experience. If that makes any sense.
I think that also reflects like how we are as a society and as human beings as well. Like if we find something that we think works or benefits a lot of people, usually to do with money, we kind of like marinate in state. Like we don't want anything to change because, you know, we're kind of afraid of like the transitionary periods of time, which are obviously going to be difficult. And that sort of kind of puts full stops to like the idea of actual progress that is not based on sort of growth or, you know, GDP.
I was also really interested because you both in different ways talked about control, maybe not only your own control, but controlling the future. So you were saying you make your plans for exhibitions, and you were talking about, I guess, in a way also controlling the physical substance of your work so that they continue. But then isn't that what's the word? We also dream about the future as being open, you know, and full of possibility, and possibility you can't control. So how do you bring those two notions together, sort of this idea of archival control, preservation, and then this idea of potential openness? You described it a bit as a battle, Pia, I think. So how do you see that?
Yeah, I guess it's a battle because it's a battle with the art market, to be honest, because people won't want to have a work that they can't see as the same piece in their homes, for example, or that it's a challenge to preserve or to conserve. And I am very much of theory that works have a soul of their own selves. And I'm just part of that process of creation, but even when I make the work, a lot of it is about relinquishing this control to the alchemical reactions that happen in the studio. So I'm not always knowing where the work is going to go, and the idea of kind of settling on either allowing this lack of control to happen or controlling it a bit more so that it can be placed in the art market. Because we want the work to live in a space long enough so that people can admire it, but sometimes things change and things, oil paint fades or yellows, or pigments can displace a bit, or things can rust and wood can bend. But I think there's an enamorment with the static in the art world. We want the painting always to look the same. We wanted to maybe give it to our next generation and keep it in an archive or store it for 1,000 years and see if the value of it goes up, and hopefully it'll look the same. But the reality is for me that things that change are also beautiful, and there's a beauty in seeing those changes happen. So if you have a piece that will change in your own lifetime and you can experience that change with the work, there's a value in that I don't think is compatible with how we see the art market functioning currently. Or at least it's scary to feel that you're not going to have a work that's going to be exactly the same.
Yeah, I wonder if you saying that, it makes me think about, we seem to be much more able to appreciate. So if we think about film or video art, they sort of come with a disclaimer that if you do not have the next, playing medium in 5 years' time, when it won't play on that computer anymore, you run into problems. But there's still, so I think there are mediums or with photography, where you need to keep it in certain ways, at least in a museum or as a responsible collector, so it doesn't fade. But I think with works like we see in the exhibition that are out in the open, we seem to assume that there is a claim that they will never change. And that's probably not fair in a funny way.
I think there's a lot more leeway in that field when it comes to like outdoor sculpture, because if you have a metal outside, it will erode and corrode, and we actually invite those changes to happen. But painting sometimes feels a little bit more inflexible in that area. And I was thinking about this book by Federico Campagna that's called Technique and Magic, and he relates technique as the reality that we know. So why do we believe in passports but we don't believe in angels, for example? There's two ideas of what is real, and technique is what we know it's real, but magic is that ether of an idea that we can't see. And now we live in a world where everything is held accountable. We need to see the numbers and the atoms and every single detail that goes into something. And then the magic side of things is what's coming, the future, the new realities. But the thing is, we can't expect reality to change if we're not willing to change with it. And that's when I mean that maybe when we talk about property, maybe property should be able to evolve with that change and move from the technique into the magical realm.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because the idea that change is like a bad thing or it's only good when we're pushed to it is something that I'm always thinking about. That like I want to be a multidisciplinary artist, because I think like to stay even in a static role or a job is so limiting. So if I am an artist, but I'm also a philosopher, I'm not, but pretend I'm a philosopher. I'm a philosopher and I'm a carpenter. That kind of gives me the sort of leeway to kind of do what I want with my life, which is freedom, and also have that kind of intersectionality that kind of could spark new ideas, and that I could collaborate with a bunch more people, etc. So I think it just kind of opens up the future in a way, like by having all of this in ourselves. But to what you said about like control, sorry to go back, but I'm a bit of a control freak, hence why I plan everything to the letter. That's never going to happen. But I think my practice ends up being an antidote to that for some reason, because I'm always thinking about the dot or the data point, which, you know, sort of is the power in the world at the moment. We live in an information age, but every piece of data can be manipulated, and, you know, it's not concrete, it's not fact, really. If you have a bunch of numbers, they could, you know, relate to a whole bunch of different things, and we see how data is skewed and manipulated every day. And so I kind of like that, putting that sort of concept into a process. So I do this thing called puncturing, I guess, which is sort of making these kind of definitive marks that are kind of irreversible into linen. And I'm puncturing and I'm spending time sort of unpicking and unraveling, which again is like a disruptive thing, I guess. Nobody wants something that looks ragged, apparently. But that kind of is my version of sort of reflecting how the world works, because we do need that sort of reversal of, you know, perfection and the uncovering of, you know, what lies underneath to be able to move forward and to see things clearly. So we kind of need that balance between the control and the chaos. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in the process of my work. But as far as like, as it goes into the world, I think that the more control, I think, for example, Instagram, don't like it, can't use it well. However, like that is like the place to be, to sort of be visible. And I'm kind of into ideas of invisibility, sort of interweaving into every aspect of my practice and my life. You know, spirituality, or, you know, the fact that people can't see all of the process when I show a work in public.
That's really interesting, because in this way you reintroduce what Pia called magic into the work, but not actually making it even visible. I mean, obviously not making it visible, but not even maybe talking about it. So I think that's really, really interesting. And before we move on to lots of other topics, I am really interested in both of your work being so much about materiality and the question what status you think that might have in our time, as you both said, that really is about information technology and maybe the acceleration of time and everything being instantly available all the time, being inundated with, you know, digital imagery. But then both of your practices somehow try to, I don't know, do they counteract it? Do they unpick it? So I'm really interesting how you basically think that the materiality of your work and of your processes and making, physical making with hand, sort of where that sits today and why that is maybe important, or I can say it's important, but I don't know.
So I would say that I think that working with materials and working with the hands sort of like recenters the humanity of the things for me. I think, you know, there's been so many theories of like post-humanism. I just don't think that exists. I understand that the world is like, it's, you know, it exists in itself and it has animals and, you know, plants in it, yeah, but we are important as well. And I think sometimes the importance, we might think about it in this terms of like growing and development, but I think the kind of central figure of the human as like having the potential or being a tool in ourselves as a way of making progress in the world is like really important. And I think the hands are like our primary way of making that magic that Pia was talking about. And so I kind of value even like the touch, like haptics are really important to me. And I think that kind of is transferable. Like if you touch something or you see something is soft, it promotes a sort of reaction to it. So it becomes less about seeing and, you know, being passive, and more about kind of being active and, you know, wanting to touch. Like that desire of discovery, I think is is really a human instinct as well. So, yeah.
I guess for me, materiality is a way to connect to home, to be honest. I didn't realize that being so far away from, in my case, Costa Rica, was something that I would miss, because I came to London as a way to escape, in a way. And being here, all my stories became magic. I'm craving things from back home, and it's only been like 4 years, basically, at this point. But it's materials in my art practice are a way to connect. So that's why they're, as I mentioned before, salt, wood, metals, and the practice itself is quite engaging. So I move works from the floor to the walls. I'm active with my entire body. It's about playing with painting and sculpture, installation, and even sound, because when I'm chiseling away pieces of wood from the artworks, it becomes rhythmical, and it becomes something that my studio mates, I might drive them a little bit crazy sometimes, but it does engage every part of my senses, and it's a way that I can connect with the work instantly. It becomes a conversation rather than a direction. And as I mentioned before, I think that engagement between chaos and order, not knowing where things will land or how something will bend, gives me possibilities and different directions rather than a clear way. It's also, it makes me think that it's the only way that I could actually engage with like every single part of my practice, because we build pillars as artists of things that we enjoy or don't enjoy, or things that we're interested in, things that we want to challenge, stories that we want to tell. And materials happen to be the way that I'm telling my story and my relationship to home, my narratives from Costa Rica, my experiences here in London, and how I am projecting to see my future and my world. And each of those materials teach something else to the other ones that come later on. So if I'm engaging with something and there's a reaction between them, then it's the next step and it's a process, rather than just an equal engagement all the time. And it, by itself, it becomes a way of storytelling. And these objects start collecting. And collection, I think, is important. That's why we, as humans, I guess, we pass on things to each other. We keep my grandmother's rings. I keep them close to me because it reminds me of her. So the way materials work is by having that process in themselves, and then that can be kind of a timeline, even though it's not a straight timeline, or it can just be marked by the points where it has belonged. But it's in a constant evolution. And I believe that's the way I want to see my work, and I want to see it engage with the outside experiences as a back and forth, rather than just head straight on.
So if we stay just for a second with the topic, theme of technology, and I mean, we can't, in a way, you can't have a conversation anymore about the future that doesn't, talk about that. And there is, of course, a lot of debate how much the art market or the art world is shaped by, the digital and innovations in technology. You do use, though, quite a lot of technology, even if it's hidden in your work, right, Tami? So how do you think your work would be as possible if there weren't these, you couldn't use technology as we have it today? Do you think you would just find other forms? Do you think it's a tool, but it doesn't shape who we are? Sort of what I wrote down here: technology, good or bad, savior of humanity or devil. So, I mean, how would you respond to that?
I would say that I think we're quite lucky to be artists, because I think it's one of the industries that technology kind of has a limit to how much it can sort of push us to the side, and like, you know, not so that we don't have jobs anymore. I think that, like, for example, AI, which again, not a fan of, but you know, I think it has its limits to how much it can, you know, take away from us as humans with imperfect visions of the world who are trying to express ourselves. I think that's like a very human thing. But for example, like I do think that the tools that we're using or that have been used in today's world, that have been used negatively, I think have a sort of opposite effect, or could have an opposite effect if used correctly. And I only like to use technology as a reference, because I like reference photography, and I reference you know, printmaking, and I reference sort of data and, you know, the transferring of information, but from, again, a human perspective. So it's abstracted totally when it comes into my practice, except for if I'm making sound or something. But then it becomes, you know, a mate, a helper, a tool. And I think when it's used as a tool, I think, which is important, it's a positive thing. But I don't want to be a tool for technology personally. And I think, you know, even there's, I think, a couple of tech companies that are coming up that are trying to make AI sort of accessible to artists and galleries to sort of promote certain artists, for example, or for you to be able to kind of carve out your taste and suggest different artists that you might like, for example. I think there's an app, I can't remember this name. You know, that kind of thing is really cool. But then there's a limit to how much that is kind of going to be diverse, because again, it's people behind it. For the most part, it's sort of using the same kind of data that has been used to kind of distract us for a long time. So, yeah, I think it's, you know, it's good and bad, but I think for me, I use data and technology and all of those things sparingly, because it really could go away tomorrow, and it really could be, you know, obscure tomorrow. Yeah.
I really enjoy what you said, that you don't want to become a tool for technology. I think that's exactly how I feel as well. I mean, in my personal life, I do use technology, even if I don't think about it. I have AirPods and I listen to music when I'm in the studio, you know, and that's part of technology. And if we see it in the art world, yeah, I don't think AI is my thing, but I can see how it's an evolution of our reality. And I think it's going to keep on going and having its own path. It doesn't mean that it has to be the one that I have and the one that I take, but it's going to grow with us, whether we want it or not, because it's already here. And where it's going, no clue. But I think as a tool and as an instrument for our own understanding, it can be really helpful, and it can just make it, I don't know, interesting to learn. Without technology, I wouldn't be able to learn a lot of different materials, or to come to different conclusions, or have a research base, or have a digital archive of my past exhibitions or works, or where I've been. So it does work for us, as long as we don't work for it. I think that's what we are being careful about. And yeah, I think it's just a matter of how each of us individually take care of that situation.
So one thing that sort of maybe comes out of that I think is interesting, Tami, you mentioned that a lot of people perceive to technology to enable access, and I think, you know, speaking of digitization, collections become digital. People around the world who might not have the chance to go to Tate, for example, can see the collections online, and I know artists for whom that was a lifesaver in a way, growing up in some, you know, maybe to us here, distant country. So, and you also mentioned collaboration. So maybe can we talk a little bit about how do you think, or what would be meaningful for you, and therefore also for other people based on your own experiences, that would enable greater access to the arts or the art world? Because I think in our pre-meet, Pia, you mentioned also, Latino communities here. So sort of this talk about maybe does technology help us to become more accessible as a more or less elite art world? And if not, what are the steps do you think are important we could take?
I definitely think it's a platform for I can reach my community back home easily. And I was able to research about London and the Royal College of Art because of technology, and that was my gateway to come here. So it's definitely a tool that I am very grateful for. And it's a way to communicate back and forth in a matter of seconds and to translate our art practices globally and expand our own thoughts more directly. It can be manipulated, of course, but I just think it's as a way of contact, it's incredible because you were all able to come here because you probably saw an Instagram post or you just saw the information online, or somebody like word of mouth has slowly become maybe even second to that, and if we don't think that is a helpful tool, then what's the next step? I think that there will be a next step into that communication, but I would reference museums in Madrid for pieces of work that I love, but I buy a plane ticket to go there, it would be insane, rather than just Googling it. And it's that tool that allows for contact in a very different way, maybe not physical contact, but definitely visual contact, sound contact, and these other variations of. And for communities, especially like maybe outcast communities, it does bring us closer, and it makes you feel maybe even less alone. I know that when I speak to people back home or people that I've encountered here, it does bring that idea of, oh, maybe you're half an ocean away, but you understand what I'm talking about now, rather than waiting for it to happen years and years later. That's how I would see communication and technology kind of bridging together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, using the internet is great. I say that because there's lots of residencies, for example, in London for other people from other countries to come here and do short residencies, and that's kind of an easy way to sort of learn about other things that are happening in the world, in other artist communities. I think sometimes we're very in a bubble to think that this is the only place that this is happening, but there's a lot of different kind of connections that can be made. I think Gasworks is really good about kind of that kind of cross pollination of different artist communities. But I do think that sometimes we think that it should stop at the technology bit, instead of it turning into an in-person kind of communication and dialogue. And I think, for example, facilitating this event was done with technology. It's the internet, but a form of technology, and then it facilitates kind of an in-person thing. I don't think we should take for granted the sort of in-person communication and working towards that, and using technology, again, as a tool rather than the be-all and end-all of things. But I do think interesting projects can happen when sort of we're kind of connecting only through technology as well. I think it's interesting that I think I've heard of a project where artists were kind of swapping sort of materials that they had collected in their hometown and sort of documenting them and sending them to another artist to kind of get inspired by. So those kind of projects are interesting, but not as a kind of way of living, I don't think. In terms of like access, yeah, I can't really think about in terms of like access to different communities apart from that, really.
So how do you build, I mean, as a Londoner, would you say you build community based around like physical closeness or based around shared interests? How does it work for you? Because I'm so intrigued because we are in London, we are physically here, but you know, you studied together, but you come from very different places in the world. So you're, you know, local, whatever that is. So how does that work for you, Tami?
Well, I try to do it in person because I just think I'm better in person. You lose half of my personality on the internet as much as I try and cram it onto that little screen. And, you know, I think that when you meet people in person and you are networking in person and you can see and touch with your own eyes instead of on a JPEG, I think it's a very different experience. And I think experiences, the touch, the feel, and, you know, the mood you're in even, can really change the type of dialogue, like actual dialogue that you can have concerning like your art practice or, you know, who you are as a person or whatever, because it takes time. It takes like, I meet you one time and then we don't see each other and then I meet you again. And the space between, you know, meetings, for example, if we were to set up a small group and we were to have a discussion and we were to go away and, you know, it would feel resolved, but the time we go and come back, you know, life has happened, contexts have changed, social situations have changed, culture's changed, probably a new technology about, and it's more to kind of add to the story. So for me personally, I prefer to kind of meet people and do things in person, because like I am also always on Instagram, even though I hate it. Like that doesn't sit well with me, you know. But I'm browsing and it's so passive. And I think the more kind of like active I am, the better I feel about, you know, the conversations and dialogues that I'm having.
And I think that was an experience for all of us. I mean, nobody wants to talk about COVID, but when we were all put in those little boxes, the first thing, or for the majority of us, I guess, what we wanted after being let out from our houses was contact. Because we were living in that fully on technology little Zoom box for a while, and then we just wanted to be together. And I think that's what happened with our cohort at RCA. A lot of us got really close because we started with technology and then we were allowed to be in person. So kind of human contact just accelerated. We wanted that idea of seeing each other in a park with a beer, and that was all we needed. And even the art world changed. Figuration became, like, it boomed after COVID because everybody wanted to see people and figures. And now there's like that, I don't know if I should call it a trend, but that inclination towards touch was something that was allowed because technology was so immersed in our daily lives for a period of time. So it can be interesting to see how much of something can actually help produce a reaction against the other thing. Yeah, I think I would agree with you that I'm definitely much more of a contact person rather than a JPEG.
So do you think sort of trying to look into, well, maybe the near future, because there's been so much talk about, I think, that the pandemic really was would change the art world forever, and now it seems everyone is still just going back to how it used to be, just taking up more travel, flying around the world, visiting biennales and art fairs and exhibitions. Do you think we can capture some of maybe the positive spirit that came out of the pandemic, including the value of going to the local park with friends, or, you know, working with people collaboratively that you know already, rather than thinking the next best thing needs to be, I don't know, somewhere else, sort of this happiness also, or this value of the local? Do you think we can carry that on? And is that something you actively try and do?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, good, that was a quick question. I think maybe, so I want to open that to the floor, because I know there are also big topics we haven't even touched upon. So maybe you want to raise them, or maybe you have really distinct question, but I wanted to, or I asked the panel before to share or offer something that is important to them and that helps them think about the future with you guys. So you have something that you can take away from all of this. So maybe that would be a good moment to do that, and then we'll invite questions. So if you don't have a question, think about it now. Okay, Pia, you were the one. I'm going to pick on you because you were the one who was like, yeah, I prepared my things.
Well, no, I guess when we were discussing it, I wanted to maybe bring the attention to this one podcast that I've really been enjoying. It's called Over Morrow's Library. And it's by the same author of that book that I referenced, Federico Campagna. And he is an Italian philosopher that talks about tomorrow as, what this says, over morrow, over tomorrow. And the idea of building your own library, building your own archive, and your own kind of, be that a virtual, be that a physical idea of the pieces that you hold dear. So for him, he's doing it in a podcast version, but he spreads topics through like cryptography and then ancient myths and ancient philosophers. And that was quite an inspiration to me to just start doing the same idea of collecting, but of the things that I'm actually interested about outside the art world. And that piece in the back of the gallery, it's also called Over Morrow, thinking about that opening of the space into the future.
Great, thank you. Tami?
I was actually reading Ernst's blog, and a couple of philosophers. Again, I'm not a philosopher, but I kind of like the idea of bringing sort of philosophy theory into the kind of practical world, about thinking about how like the future is very much not one thing, and it's like very pluralistic. So even if things are happening like in this space in a certain way, it doesn't mean that like a bunch of other different ways of being and acting and seeing the art world and existing as a human being, like whether it's out in a forest or whatever. The world is a big place and there's so many different versions of the future, and that we don't have to kind of stick to this one version of this kind of like environmentally sound, everybody's doing exactly what their DNA tells them to do type of kind of future. So that's Ernest's blog. But also, actually, I've also been reading a lot of Gilbert Simondon. He's French. Sorry, I don't know why I say that. It's because of the way I pronounced it. And I think a lot about process and like marker points. And I think that his theories of self-individuation are a really good way of thinking about how, internally we can sort of change and develop and grow, and that it's all a journey. Like even a point in time is a journey in itself, to sort of kind of lend to this idea of like practice makes better, I guess, or practice makes change, in some kind of way.
Yeah, I really like that because I also do read, which is, I'm very hopeful about that, but I've been reading, and I think it sort of maybe brings together what both of you said. I've been reading about the miner lately, and there are lots of people write about this, but I think it really chimes the idea that maybe the future, it's maybe not so productive to think about the future in these big throws. We all need to do this, or we all need to do this, and art that's being shown at the Venice Biennale is the only thing worthy, so which would all encompass the idea of the major, but it's about plurality, points in time, points in space, markers, individuality. That doesn't mean that we fall apart as society, but it means we acknowledge that the future can't be one thing. And I'm stopping here now because I think that was That's it. That's it. That's what we're going to offer you. And now, please do any questions you have.
I think actually the studio is the only place I relinquish that control that freely. And it comes back to the idea of letting materials dictate that, letting them explore the possibilities and letting them kind of take you as an artist into that state of, I don't know what people call it, ecstasy, or just like the sublime moment where you know you're creating but you're not thinking. It's more about letting go and exploring and just allowing that that bliss to fill you up and just happen. Control is, again, something that is very much something I want to let go, but it's hard because I want things to look a certain way, or I'm tempted to do things that work. And maybe that's something that I have to put into practice in my personal life, for example. That not all things work out the way I want them and they don't come in the time that I want them to. But losing a little bit of that control allows for other things to happen, and possibilities and explorations and opportunities. But relinquishing that control personally just happens in the studio, and it comes every once in a while. It's one of the hardest things that you have to do as an artist, because we have our visions and our stories and our narratives and the reality that we live in. And I think that's why we make art, that's why we make work, to kind of let that seep out and have its own life outside of our own bodies, and let that be its own idea. And then we can understand it back again.
And I would say I don't relinquish control, it just happens. I hold on very tightly, and then mistakes are made, but mistakes end up being the magic, and other things like, oh, I didn't know that could do that, or just like small things like that that kind of like spur on. And I think like art and even the process of making is a really like self-evolving thing in itself. It's like very separate from the artist in a way. And so sometimes you think you have control, but you don't. So I kind of like that, sort of trying to grab for it and always missing.
Pieces that I've revisited after even a few months, or they surprise me, and that control. Oh my God, yesterday I was in the studio for 12 hours, and that was a control that I had to let go. Like, go home, let it rest. It'll be here in the morning. That's one version of that, and allowing for that calmness to come, like coming down from that high of the studio. And the control of the work, it's, I guess, the reason why I have pieces showing. When I see something that is, okay, you're done, I've spoken to you as long as I can, and now it's your time to do something else. And revisiting that piece of work in a few years can teach something, because I've left space for change. It will rust, it will erode, it'll saturate more, or just change. And that's one of the things that I think I've had the most difficulty accepting in my practice, because it's scary. I don't know what the work is going to do, and I can't give that security to somebody else as well. And I guess I just find a beauty in that. I think it's quite special not to know when I see a work back again, the next conversation we'll have.
Can I just say something actually on that as well? I think the idea of creating systems like we do in the wider world is also really interesting to me, because there's always going to be gaps and like pitfalls of those systems. So like, for example, in my last exhibition, there was it was quite a small room, but there was like a way that you had to go through the exhibition that I had said, this is the way that it works. Like, it's like this. You go in, you look, and you go out, and then you listen to the music. But there's also, and it's like really instructional, but like rules are meant to be broken. That really plays a role in the way that I think about like the art in relation to the viewer, in that, you know, for example, Stephanie was saying that she didn't see the exhibition, but she was listening to the link of the sound, and like that separation and that kind of like different modes of looking and different levels, like experiencing the art to the level that you want to almost, and the levels that you could, like, there's so many different ways. For example, there was a lot of holes everywhere, and you could look through the holes, and some holes you wouldn't look through because you're not going to look through all of those 100 holes, you know, and you know, whether you listen to the music in general, like in relation to the work when you're in the space or outside of it, like those kind of gaps in the system are really important, even to think about, like, as an art community as well. Like, there's this way that they say is the way. You go to openings, you get your art scene, you put it in great collections so that you can build a following, and you know, you can have all of this prestige because your art is part of this amazing collection or part of this great institution. But then there's kind of other ways that I think can happen at the same time, where you are involved in non-profit, community-led, artist-led shows as well, and that's also a value.
I mean, there has to be a balance. I can't tell you where that balance is. That's, I guess, what I'm trying to also figure out through the work. There has to be a stabilizer. Like, it cannot. There's some works that just have to live for a day, and they'll change, and they'll be gone, and forever exist in the ether, in our minds, and your photograph, and your memories, and that's one way to record them. I don't know how you would own them, or you can translate through word of mouth. Like, we did storytelling before that, and that was a way of passing that ownership of a tale or a myth down our generations. Personally, I think I'm trying to reach that balance, or to understand it in my own way. I don't want my works to change as quickly as, you know, like they'll decay and next morning you'll just find like a little piece of wood on your windowsill. I want them to be seen by hopefully generations, but I cannot control the material. I cannot control if like this building will have the test of time. And ownership of that, it's a very good question, but I really wish I had a better answer than just finding that balance, and kind of structuring, in my personal way, my work to be able to change, but maybe not quick enough, or just so that it's subtle, or you can see it throughout your own lifetime, and maybe then you can tell a story. I'm still learning how to mix those two things. I think maybe eventually I'll find a way of controlling that. But right now, I'm just happy exploring the possibilities of that change. And hopefully for the owners of my work, they can have that exploration with me.
I think we're sort of past the time that we think that like artists should be poor and not make money from their work, which I think is the deciding factor, personally. Like, if my work was able to not be sold at all and I could still own it, I think I would, and if I had space to store it, because that's also an issue. But you know, the reality is, like, the work, as much as it's like my passion and my pastime, and I think through art, is also a commodity. And like that kind of like transfer of wealth, it's not wealth, but you know, the transfer of like monies for a product really is also like on top of my mind, because I want to keep on doing it. And all of those have like different levels of, you know, having to put your pride or your whatever aside to kind of continue in a way. And so I don't think, I would like to be less precious about the work, because sometimes I don't show things because I'm precious about it. And things remain in my studio because it's not good enough, or it doesn't fit into this kind of vision that I'm plotting for myself still, because I'm trying to look moves ahead about where I want to be and who I want to show with, and who I want to be affiliated with, and that is kind of the agency of that, of like deciding that, is quite important to me. And so I think it's a balance.
And I think we also live in a world where ideas form a way of ownership. Like artworks right now, we speak about them, and the idea behind an artwork sometimes is even more powerful than the object itself, or what they're, I don't know why, I don't remember the name of this piece, but it was in one of the art fairs. It went viral on the internet, the banana with the tape. Yeah. And we all recognize that idea, and we all recognize that artwork, and we can even make it at home, but the idea of a piece and the ownership of that piece became global. And it became something that we almost speak about it as not a myth, but something that is enduring in time with the collective self. So that's, I guess, that idea of how do we control that ownership. It became global. It became part of that almost same as a cave painting and telling stories inside a cave painting, and how those myths kind of translated into our time. And we all know, the story of this very different example of Zeus and the myths and the Greek gods and the Norse gods and everything, but it's a way of translating those ideas of how we relate to the world and what's our new myth. And the banana and the tape can be a new myth, It's a way of seeing art and collecting those things for ourselves, and maybe translating them in a different way. Rather than the objects, ideas can be quite persuasive. Commodifying the work is something that, as Tami said, we artists, we want to do what's best for our practices, but we also have to eat and pay the bills and do the living situation behind having an art practice. So I think in my case, I will like to say that I will never sacrifice my art practice for a commodity. I will always enjoy more doing the work that makes me think that I'm actually saying something true and speaking about my language, my narrative, my views of the world, and maybe even topics that I want to discuss in the works. And finding that, again, balance, I guess, between making work that other people will understand and want to care for and kind of continue this journey with me with the practice, and then commodifying something to an extent that it's just churning them out. It's very difficult because one seems like the very bad guy and the other one's the good guy, but as the reality is that we as artists want to make this for as long as we live. I know I want to be an artist for the rest of my days, and that's what's the only thing that's going to make me happy, and I need to find a way to make that my livelihood and my happiness. So commodifying the work, I wouldn't say commodifying is what is in the foreground of my mind. Sometimes it just happens, like obviously painting is always kind of like the top tier of things that people will put in their houses because it's easily kind of visible, and you can see that very clearly, and it's something that small pieces will eventually sell maybe easier, or but at the same time, it's like, I know I like to think of myself as a museum artist, and I want to make works that will fit in those spaces. And I won't do that if I am commodifying my work. So it's about risks and taking those risks and not being fearful that if I don't make a painting that's going to go in somebody else's house, I know that I'll get to the museum somehow, but it's something that I personally believe is the way for me. I like to think that maybe in the age that we live now, that dream is available a little bit, easier, not easier, but possible.
If I Sorry, if you don't mind me coming in here. I think it's also, obviously we have now two artists on the panel, but I think it's a two-way street, right? And I think what hopefully also events like this do is bridge that maybe also the gap that we have or sometimes have between collectors and the artist as the producer of the commodity. And I think sort of the responsibility doesn't only sit with the artists, of course it also sits with the collectors, and I think and of course then the galleries who mediate that. And I actually think we shouldn't underestimate the passion that I think a lot of collectors do have, and the stories that they hold dear, and that these objects mean for them, and that they will therefore care for. So I think on that sense, I think it's about this, what I think Markisa also said with your question, this responsibility on everybody who participates. And maybe the stories at the moment are more, because they're more about money, they're more about people just buy stuff wholesale and then they flip it in a year. But they are not about the collectors who never do that. And there are these people, and I'm sure some are in the room, who behave like that, or so I think it shouldn't only be on your shoulders, right?
Yeah, of course. It's a conversation, and it's that's why artists need galleries, and galleries look for collectors, and it's a team. It's about everybody. It's an environment, and for it to thrive, everybody has to put in their own little work, piece.
Yeah, and all their own values in that as well.
Personally, I have been to answer that question with what I've kind of learned is I've been reading this book published by David Zwirner, but it's the writings of Vallance, and it's called The Cathedral is Dying. And he speaks about, or at least the introduction speaks about his passion for the Gothic cathedrals in France, and how he went around and he drew all of these beautiful details of the cathedrals because he was so in love with the Gothic and the magic of nature and architecture and the human in that. And after the Second World War, a lot of these cathedrals were bombed, and he would advocate that we shouldn't restore these cathedrals because they were part of a time that is no longer with us. And we'll never be as good as the Gothic architects and the Gothic builders that did this, because we have new technologies that could make it better, but not the same. And he advocates for let the ruins be a ruin, and let those ruins live in their own time, and we kind of grow with them. This decision about whether us as a society have decided that we should kind of keep collecting things from other times and let them settle into the new, or maybe like more of the Eastern traditions of if something breaks, maybe we repair it, but we let those cracks be seen, and not fully disguise the past and make it part of the present and kind of trick it into being part of our future, but just, in my opinion, let a ruin be a ruin and let a work evolve into maybe this ruin, but it has a beginning and an end. It had a life, and we ourselves have our own path and our own time here. So it speaks about our own temporality and what we would like to consider ourselves maybe towards our end, like being preserved, or let us maybe age a little bit more gracefully into the future.
And for me, I think I start at the end. I like things looking like they've had a life, even if they haven't really had much of one, even if the life is just the process of me making it. I think like ruins and the more of the cycle of time, of like things being built and then becoming, and that's how civilizations rise and fall. I like that aspect of things, and I think objects are a great way of like having a fragment of history or a fragment of a potential future with you, but you're never going to have the entirety. So I kind of like, the preservation of objects because, it's not the whole story, and then it's imagination, evidence, and that's kind of like exciting, like the discovery of things. And I think that objects and works of art sort of give you that journey and the potential of like finding new things, undiscovered things, new knowledge that could add to or change our perception of the world. But we just don't use it like that. We just use it as like pretty little trinkets, but I don't know.
I don't see my practice correlating with the blockchain that much. I would love people to see my work in 3,000 years, hopefully, but maybe it's about evolving with the time, and maybe that's what it has to happen. Hopefully, maybe when I'm not here, somebody will do that. But right now, I'm really happy with the way I archive it, with a photograph, with maybe collectors that will keep it and pass it down. I know I get a lot of messages on like Instagram asking for NFTs, and every time I'm like, no, sorry, I don't do that type of work. Or like, if I would make it into an NFT. And to be honest, I think that is quite contradictory to my philosophy of materials and how they decay and how they move into the world. But I know it's changing. I know it's part of the environment that we're moving into. So it's very difficult to say if it will happen. I don't have the interest to do it myself personally, like to put it in the blockchain. But I know it's out there, and it's something that is definitely moving the art world and making changes on its own.
Yeah, I was going to say no. I was going to say no, because I sort of think about making art in the context of discourse, and sometimes discourse, like, as you said before, it kind of like, it's a moment in time and then it's written about and conversation. That's more important to me than like people even seeing the work. I don't mind, even though I hope this doesn't happen, if like at the end of my life that's it and nobody hears about my work again, because I hopefully will be doing like the work and will see like, personally the kind of effects and the conversations that come out of it. After I'm dead, I don't care.
That'll be the perfect church.
They're down dramatically.
Perfect. I think that was a perfect final statement. So I think we should leave it at that. Thank you so much for taking the time.